I've put together this screencast so that people can check it out if they want to, and also I thought it might be useful for those people who missed the first seminar. So, in this first seminar, I thought it would be helpful to think in broad terms about some conceptual frameworks for parent work. What range of things might fall under the rubric of parent work? How do we think about it? What are some of the aims of parent work? And some of the technical challenges. Okay, before we go into some of that, I thought it might be useful just to map out the suggested structure and content for the seminars, and this is something that we can adapt as we go along, but essentially what we're going to do is alternate between presentations of parent work using process note recordings and some seminars where we will be looking at some specialist subtopics relating to parent work. Some of the suggested ones are we might look at working with parental mental health, working with personality disorders, thinking about doing parent work with looked after children, and that might include working with foster parents, also working with adoptive parents, and thinking about working with networks and systems. Another area I thought it might be interesting to cover would be thinking about parent work with parents of children with disabilities. And that would include neurodevelopmental conditions, learning difficulties, and also physical disabilities. And then finally, I thought it would be useful for us to think about parent work in the context of attachment theory as a conceptual framework, and also thinking about the idea of parental reflective functioning. So as you can see from the structure on the left, what we'll probably do is alternate week by week between presentations and then slotting in subtopics as we need to. Okay, so I'm just going to think a little bit about the idea of the parent work continuum, or different kinds of parent work, based on a model outlined in Margaret Rustin's 1998 paper. So she describes 4 different kinds of parent work, really. So the first of these is parent work that aims to sustain and protect the child work. So these are cases where gaining the support of parents to protect and sustain the child's therapy is the prime aim. The second kind of parent work that she outlines involves supporting parental functioning. So this group would include parents who feel that they can't make sense of a child's behaviour and relationships, and who seek a better understanding of their children's problems, and parents who are struggling to cope with very difficult life circumstances that might include family illness, economic stress, disability, bereavement, and so forth. These parents usually either see themselves as working in partnership with the professionals or feel in need of help themselves, but with a focus being clearly on their role as parents. The third type of work that she describes is work aimed at changing family functioning. So here the explicit aim of the work is a change in family functioning, and this has been agreed by the parents as part of the treatment as a whole. There are different styles of work which may be appropriate, including marital therapy, individual work with a focus on the intra-family relationships, or family therapy as such. The fourth kind of parent work is described as psychotherapeutic work with one or both parents. So at this other end of the spectrum is individual psychotherapy for one or indeed both parents, to which the parents have committed themselves as patients in their own right, even if the issues which have brought them into contact with psychotherapists have started off as a concern for the child. And both therapies aimed at change within the family and psychoanalytic psychotherapy can function either in parallel alongside treatment of a child or on their own. So one of the things that she points out is that these different ways of thinking about parent work actually sit along a continuum, and we can think of the characteristics of that continuum. So at one end we have work that is more supportive, whilst at the other end we have work that is more psychoanalytic. In the more psychoanalytic end of the parental work spectrum, there is more emphasis on parental change. And at the more supportive end of the continuum, there is less emphasis on parental change and more emphasis on supporting the child work. The more psychotherapeutic work will work with the parent's internal world, but always with an implicit aim of keeping the child in mind. The parent's internal world is of interest insofar as it colours the relationship that the parent is able to have with the child. This doesn't map quite so clearly onto the continuum, but broadly speaking, we might anticipate that at the more supportive end, contact with parents might be less frequent, perhaps as infrequent as termly or half-termly reviews, and that work aimed at psychological change with the parents will be more frequent and require more frequent contact. But although the frequency spectrum broadly maps onto that, we could imagine circumstances in which psychological work is possible with relatively infrequent contact, or that some parents may require more frequent contact simply to be able to tolerate allowing the child work. Aims of the parent work. What are we trying to achieve when we undertake parent work, either in parallel with child work or independently of child work? Firstly, parent work involves helping parents to think about their child. This can take a number of different forms, including helping parents to make sense of their child's behaviour and develop a sense of what the world might look like from the child's point of view. A second aim related to that might be helping parents to differentiate from their child and recognise their child as separate with their own thoughts and feelings. So with parents who for a variety of reasons may be entangled with their child, parent work can facilitate differentiation and withdrawal of projections and unhelpful identification, so that the parent is able to see their child more clearly and also their own issues. And this can also help reduce intergenerational patterns. The function of containing parental anxieties and providing containment for parents is very important in parent work and can over time support parents to be more able to function as a container for their own children. Reducing parental projections links with the second point, but this can include the parent confusing their own feelings with those of the infant, which also impairs attuned interactions. Such parents also often have difficulty acknowledging their own feelings in relation to parenting, denying such common emotions as guilt, anger and joy. Some parents, as in the ghost in the nursery phenomenon, have distorted perceptions of their child that involve projection. He's evil, just like his dad. You can't take your eye off. Finally, fostering empathy, mentalization and reflective functioning. So reflective functioning involves the parent's capacity to recognize that their child has mental states, that he has feelings, thoughts and intentions of his own, a recognition of the child's uniqueness and difference and separateness as a person in his own right. Research suggests that a parent's capacity to make sense of their child's mental states is linked to a capacity to think about their own mental states and feelings, and that this is intrinsic to sensitive and attuned parenting. So thinking about some delivery modalities, we might think about who sees the parents. Should that be the child's therapist, or should that be another therapist? And in some circumstances, maybe is the parent worker the only therapist involved? Who the parents C may often be a practical and logistical issue, but ideally some consideration might be given to the type of parent work and linked to the aims of the parent work. Work at the more psychotherapeutic end of the continuum may be more problematic, both logistically and in terms of boundary management, for a single therapist who's attempting to work with the child at the same time. How frequently should the parents be seen? This could be as frequently as weekly or fortnightly or perhaps half-termly or even termly. And again, frequency may be a practical or logistical issue, but it's worth thinking about what is the optimum frequency, and that's also linked to the type and aims of the parent work. Deep psychological change is likely to require more frequent and extended work, but some parents may need frequent holding just to be able to support the therapy. The other question is one parent or two, separately or together. There is research evidence suggesting that involving fathers can be a positive thing. This may or may not be practical, and it may or may not be appropriate depending on the situation. Lastly, as we've already thought about, should this work be in conjunction with child work or not? Rustin suggests it could be either. Okay, some technical issues in parent work. So I guess one of them is where to focus, both in the sense of to what extent are we focusing on the parent and the parenting, the parent's own history or experience of being parented, or the child, understanding the child's behavior, and so forth. Another technical issue is the use of interpretation and taking up the unconscious. Do we work primarily with the conscious and the external, or should we be using what we're picking up from unconscious communication in some sort of way? Linked to that, I think, is the use of transference and countertransference. So to what extent is it appropriate to use transference interpretations, and how might one use one's countertransference to support the parent work and understand some of the issues, even though one may not explicitly take that up in the form of interpretation? And I think that linked to but separate from the issue of whether or not to take things up in the transference and the use of countertransference is the issue of some particular countertransference difficulties that are specific to parent work. For example, over-identification with the child in relation to the parents, or over-identification with the parents can make parent work problematic, but also confusion in relation to the internal parents as seen from the perspective of the child's therapy versus the external parent. And finally, also countertransference issues that may be related to our own experiences of being parent. Another issue is about addressing hostility and destructiveness, particularly if it's covertly expressed and particularly if it's unconscious. And finally, another issue specific to parent work, particularly working with two parents, is the issue of managing parental conflict. So just thinking about assessment and parent work, and thinking about the role of thinking about parent work as part of an assessment process, we might want to think about what part does assessment of the parents take in assessment for child or adolescent psychotherapy? What part do we think the parents might play in the process of change? And what are the conscious and unconscious motivations in relation to seeking help and the parent's capacity for engagement in psychological work? And I think these things are important when thinking about aims and thinking about where on the continuum the work should be. And I think there's a broad issue that links all of these things together, which is how do we engage parents in thinking about what the parent work might involve? So in summary, I thought this quote was quite useful from Arietta Slade. She, in talking about parent work, says there is certainly no single way of approaching this work that will be universally helpful to children and families. And we often find our way as we go. And hopefully, finding our way as we go is something that we'll be able to do as we move through these seminars.